Ladies and gentlemen, hello from Copenhagen. Welcome to our webinar, Choosing the Right Financing Solution for our Energy Efficiency Project, hosted by Copenhagen Center on Energy Efficiency. This webinar is organized under the umbrella of the Building Efficiency Accelerator. My name is Aris, and I am a program officer at the Copenhagen Center. One of my tasks is to support the activities related to our energy efficiency webinars, and today I will be your webinar moderator. A couple of things before we move to the main content of our webinar. This webinar is going to last about 70 minutes, including time for questions at the end. In case you cannot stay until the end or want to get back to our interesting presentations, the materials and the recordings of the whole webinar will be available online in a few days on the Copenhagen Center's knowledge management system. Then we have many other webinars and information. Have a look. A few things about the Copenhagen Center. The Center conducts research and advisory activities in the field of energy efficiency and serves as energy efficiency hub for the Sustainable Energy for All initiative. The Center has an established network of global, regional, and national partners with a broad range of stakeholders to help accelerate the implementation of energy efficiency activities. We also support Building Efficiency Accelerator with hosting different webinars from various partners. On a regular basis, the Copenhagen Center is conducting webinars. All materials, including recordings and presentations from previous webinars, can be found on the Copenhagen Center's knowledge management. Under the e-learning section, we have a shortcut for the Building Efficiency Accelerator webinar collection. The material of today's webinar will be uploaded there shortly. I would like to briefly introduce the speaker of today's webinar. Dr. Steve Fawkes is a senior advisor at EnergyPro Ltd. Corinne Figueredo is working at International Finance Corporation as a senior operation officer. And Markov is an international energy efficiency finance expert at Econoler. Finally, I would like to inform that you can send us your questions during the presentations, and we will do our best to answer as many as we can at the end. Please do not forget to mention the name of the panelist that the question is for. Therefore, without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, I would like our first speaker for today's event, Dr. Steve Fawkes, to take the floor.
Good afternoon, everybody. I've been asked to speak about energy efficiency financing principles and mechanisms. And obviously this is a high level run through. There's a lot more detail behind all of this, but I'm just going to focus on principles and some mechanisms. At the end of the day, there are a lot of mechanisms for financing energy efficiency, and we don't have time today to talk about all of them. So I just always like to remind people about what the challenge is here and what we're working on. The current investment that goes into energy efficiency globally, according to the IEA, the International Energy Agency, is somewhere around $230 billion a year. There are some questions about how you measure that, but let's take that number as accurate. And IEA, working with ARENA, has said to achieve a 66% probability 2-degree scenario will require the average investment in energy efficiency between now and 2050 to increase to more than $1 trillion a year. So the average between now and 2050 needs to increase by a factor of 5. And given we're starting at about 230, actually by 2040, 2050, we need to multiply that annual investment probably by a factor of 10. So accelerating the rate of investment in energy efficiency is a critical issue. And in order to do that, we need to finance capital projects and capital projects that have reasonable returns and paybacks. But at the end of the day, we need to finance a lot of capital projects. So it's just worth also, I think, setting the scene and thinking about the types of energy efficiency projects that are out there, because I think all of them are relevant. We often just focus on retrofits being standalone energy efficiency projects where the primary purpose is energy efficiency. And an example of that would be an LED conversion or changing a boiler or changing an HVAC plant in a building, where what you're really trying to do is just about energy efficiency. So that's one type of project, and it's a type that gets most attention. But two other types of projects are also important. One is what I call embedded projects. So this is where energy efficiency is built into a wider renovation or refurbishment project, where the primary purpose is something other than energy efficiency. And a good example of that is a major building refurbishment, and a specific example is the Empire State Building, where, as many people will know, a few years ago it had this major refurbishment and achieved very significant energy savings. But at the end of the day, that refurbishment was about bringing that building into the modern world. It wasn't about energy efficiency. Energy efficiency was a good side effect almost, and in itself it has lots of things that we can learn, but the project itself was all about bringing the building into the 21st century. And then, of course, there are new build projects, new buildings or new factories that are more energy efficient than building codes or building regulations. So, for instance, a new building built to Passive House standard would be an example of this. You know, building a building to code or regulation isn't about energy efficient, although it will be more efficient than an older building built 10 or 20 years ago, but it's not really energy efficiency, it's business as usual. But if we build a building that's way in advance of code, then I count that as energy efficiency. So in thinking about investment in energy efficiency, we need to think about these kinds of projects. Okay, so project life cycle. Well, projects, whether they're energy efficiency projects, building a new building, building a new factory, or developing a new product, almost any kind of project goes through a similar life cycle. And it's really important to bear this in mind. So there's a development period, and that's everything from somebody having a bright idea that there might be a project, right through to detailed technical and economic development of the idea. Then there's an underwriting period, and underwriting is really about making the decision, and it doesn't matter whether that decision is from an external investor or lender or internal, it really doesn't matter, but there's always a point at which somebody somewhere is making a decision to invest money. And then after that, of course, investment flows into the project and implementing the project. And in the case of very large projects, that can happen over a long period, or smaller projects, it can happen in a day. But there's always a period during which there's investment. And then once that project is in place, it's in operational mode, it's actually performing. So if it's an energy efficiency project, it's saving energy. If it's a renewable energy project, it's generating energy. But there's all projects of all types generally go through this cycle of development, underwriting, investment, and performance. And it's important to recognize that there are risks all the way through any project. We used to say that energy efficiency projects had no risk, but that's actually nonsense, because every project has some risk. Every project is about predicting the future in some way, and as somebody once said, predicting the future or forecasting is difficult, particularly about the future. So there's always risk, and the development period is very high risk. If you have an idea for a project, you know, there's lots of factors at play as to whether that project actually happens. And when you're developing a project, again, it really doesn't matter what kind of project, but when you're developing a project, you're spending time and money and resources working out whether you can actually get that project through to implementation. And as you move through that period, your risk comes down. It's still there, but risk comes down as you get more certainty about the project. And then in the underwriting period, there's risk. You know, you could be taking it to an investment committee, and the investment committee might say no, or you know, other factors that are at play that stop the project going ahead. And then during investment, you know, projects go wrong during investment. People make mistakes, people build things in the wrong way. There's all kinds of risks that happen even during investment. And then even for an energy efficiency project, during the performance period when it should be saving, there are risks. You know, Is the building being used in the way that we anticipated when we okayed the project? Is the factory producing the same stuff? All those factors come into play, even down to the weather can affect the level of energy efficiency savings. So there are risks all the way through. And if we think about those kind of periods in the project life cycle, the front end is about development finance. And development finance, typically in other worlds, other than energy efficiency, development is about equity. It's about somebody spending their own money in an equity risk. Of course, in the energy efficiency world, it could also be about having a grant, a project development assistance grant, or some other kind of grant, but essentially that money is at risk because ultimately you do not know whether that project will go forward and how it will perform. And then once you get into the investment phase itself for a real project, what you're talking about there is project implementation finance. I have to be careful here because project finance has a specific meaning in very large projects, but what we're talking about here is whatever project implementation finance is being used, and typically that would be debt of some description. And the bottom line in the world at large is, particularly in energy efficiency, is development capital is quite scarce, and at the moment project finance is quite abundant. There is a lot of money seeking a yield, a return, a lot of debt money out there for different kinds of projects, as long as they're good bankable projects. And I think sometimes we focus too much on the issue of project implementation finance and not enough on development finance and how do we fund getting from here's a great idea, let's do some energy efficiency in this portfolio, through to here's a set of bankable projects. And I actually think that development finance and development skills gap is one of the major issues. So it's important just to be clear about project lifecycle and different types of finance. And then when we talk about mechanisms for financing energy efficiency, I said earlier there are a lot, and there are. And none of them, well, very few of them are novel or innovative. There's a lot of talk about innovative finance in energy efficiency, but actually most of these things are not particularly innovative. You know, the first one is, of course, an organization or a householder could spend their own capital, which is internal financing. There's also loans or mortgages for buildings. There's leasing. There are specialized energy funds, and there's property funds. Financing of energy service contracts through ESCOs, which we'll talk a bit about later, and that comes in lots of flavors: energy performance contracts, chauffage, energy service agreements, and various other types of contracts which appear here just as acronyms. There's a whole another seminar about all of those, but essentially it's about using an energy service company and how you finance it. And then there's on-bill recovery, where you add something to your electricity bill. It's been fairly successful in some parts of the world. We tried it in the UK with something called the Green Deal, and it didn't work, but it didn't work for reasons other than the mechanism itself. And then one that always gets a lot of attention is property assessed clean energy, PACE, which has been very big in the US. I'll talk a bit about that in a minute. Guarantee funds, footing funds, green bonds, and yield Ks. All of these things can be used to finance energy efficiency, and all of them have their place depending on the types of projects and the size and other factors. So there's no shortage of mechanisms. There isn't just one mechanism, there's multiple mechanisms. So if we're going to scale up financing, I always talk about my jigsaw of energy efficiency finance, and I think it's a useful model. You know, we need to provide finance. We need to develop pipeline. That's a critical thing. This is bridging this gap between, hey, here's a good idea, let's do some energy efficiency, through to really good bankable projects. We need some standardization, which I'll talk about briefly, and we need to build capacity. And we need all of these things in the same place at the same time. And when we talk about providing finance, we mean long-term project finance, which is debt typically. We need project development finance, which might be equity or grants. If we talk about developing pipeline, one of the big problems in the whole energy efficiency finance world is that projects are very small, and we need to aggregate projects. And we can do that through a number of mechanisms, including procurement frameworks and what are called super ESCOs, and I'll come back to that in a minute. And then standardization. Some of you would have heard me talk before about the Investor Confidence Project. That's a method of standardizing the development and documentation of energy efficiency projects. Standardization is critical if we're going to get scale, but it goes beyond the ICP. It also goes to standardized systems and underwriting. And then in terms of building capacity, we need to build capacity in the finance industry. There is a lot of interest in financing energy efficiency, but not much capability. If you phone most banks and try and talk to an energy efficiency person, you might, if you're lucky, be put onto their facilities manager, but you probably won't be put onto a banker who understands energy efficiency. And if you do, he'll probably talk about solar panels or wind farms, which isn't really energy efficiency. And then the other areas we need to build capacity. We need to build capacity in the supply chain, people who can do the work, identify the projects, develop the projects. And we need to build capacity on the demand side. People have to want to buy projects and want to finance those projects. Otherwise, none of this will come together. So I just want to talk about some of the mechanisms briefly. Specialized energy efficiency funds, there are a number of these around the world. I picked London Energy Efficiency Fund because A, I'm in London, and B, I sit on the investment committee of LEAF, so I know it well. Yeah, it's a long-term debt fund established with ERDF money plus some private sector debt. It's managed by Amber Infrastructure, who are professional fund managers. And over the last few years, it's invested more than 110 million in public sector and private sector projects. So it has actually deployed quite a lot of capital, which is more than many of the funds that were set up back at about the same time. On tax financing, this is the property assessed clean energy. This is where people pay for the improvements in energy efficiency on their property taxes, and it can either be residential or commercial projects. And it's financed about $4.7 billion worth of projects since 2008. So again, it's got scale. It's low risk because it's on people's property tax, and people tend to pay their property tax. And it's been widely copied in Canada, Australia, and elsewhere. Now, the interesting thing for people in Europe is this is now being developed in Europe through Horizon 2020 project called EuroPace, and everybody should take a look at that project, and if they can, find a way of getting involved in it. So PACE is a system that has worked very well in the US, and hopefully we can bring it to Europe. Forfeiting funds. Forfeiting is basically about buying cash flows, and another example come out of Latvia, which is the Latvian Baltic Energy Efficiency Fund. This is where projects are being done to renovate Soviet era housing, and those projects generate long-term cash flows, and the forfeiting fund, which has been set up by EBRD and F3, a private initiative, exists to purchase the cash flows, because the energy service company can develop the project, implement the project, and then it has a stream of cash flows, but it doesn't have the ability to raise more money to do it, so it needs to sell the cash flows. Finally, I talked about the development gap, and ESCOs. People talk about ESCOs and energy service companies and energy performance contracts a lot, and they often talk about them as if they're the solution to the problem, and I really don't think they're the solution. They're part of the solution. That model of energy performance contracts is useful in the public sector. It generally doesn't transfer into other sectors, and ESCOs don't fill this development gap. They don't undertake high-risk development. They just respond to RFQs. Whereas these super ESCOs, and there's only a few around, they tend to be super developers, and the big examples in the world which have achieved scale are EESL, that's Energy Efficiency Services Limited out of India, which again we know well as we work with them, and the Etihad Super ESCO in Dubai, where the super ESCO is doing the development at scale in big portfolios of properties, and then the work gets done by individual energy service companies. And the third example, which is actually a procurement fund here in the UK, Carbon Energy Fund, which works in hospitals. Again, they do this development piece and they do it at scale, and then work is actually conducted by energy service companies on their framework. So I think the super ESCO model and its variations is really worth looking at, and it's got a long way to go, lots of things to be developed in that. Standardization, I talked about the Investor Confidence Project. I won't go into the detail, but basically the Investor Confidence Project can standardize projects using this Investor Ready Energy Efficiency label. So it's a quality project, a quality mark for individual projects. And it's available across the EU for buildings, industry, street lighting, and district energy. Building capacity in the financial sector, I said, was important, and this is just to highlight one piece of work that came out at the end of last year, the EFIG, the Energy Efficiency Financial Institutions Group Underwriting Toolkit. This is an online toolkit to help financial institutions better understand and better value and appraise the risk of energy efficiency projects. And again, it's a good start. I think it's useful for developers. One of the purposes of it was to help project developers and finance people speak the same language, or at least have a common language, because often at the moment, finance people speak finance and energy efficiency speak energy efficiency, and there's not much translation going on. So that's an important piece of work, which again is all online and available for people to look at. So finally, I think in thinking about cities, cities can play a major role in assembling this jigsaw. They can enable low-cost funds, including sometimes bonds. They can support mechanisms such as PACE. They can also aggregate their own estate. Cities tend to have big estates themselves. They can play a part in local regulations, which can help develop pipeline. And they can convene other real estate owners to come together. And as far as standardization goes, obviously they can adopt ICP, Investor Confidence Project, and promote standardized systems. In building capacity, you can build links to vocational training and education, and cities really can take the lead on quality standards for energy efficiency. So I think there's an important role to play. I think it's important that all those pieces come together. So just to conclude, energy efficiency financing is a developing market with lots of potential, but it's not just about the money. You need to bring the finance, the pipeline, the standardization, and capacity all together. It's really important to distinguish between development finance and project finance, and there is a big gap that needs to be filled. There's lots of money looking for projects and not enough projects out there. Many different types of mechanism exist, and which is the best mechanism will depend on the market segment, the situation, and the place, and so forth. But there's no shortage of ideas and ways, proven ways of financing this stuff. Standardization is important, and the lack of capacity in the financial sector does need addressing. But I think we're bringing these tools together now, and we can see how to do this. And there are enough examples in the world at scale, like EESL, Etihad, Carbon Energy Fund, LEAF, and so on, that show how this stuff can be done. So those are my remarks for today. So thank you, and I'll happily answer questions later.
Thanks very much for inviting IFC to add to this conversation. I thought that Steve's comments about standardization were very resonant with IFC. We've been investing in energy efficiency broadly and in green buildings and energy efficiency, and indeed resource efficiency, including water efficiency, for many years now. And what I'm going to talk about is a particular product that has arisen from the work that we've been doing in green buildings. And also I'm going to talk about the way in which IFC is engaging with cities with various different financing mechanisms. So very briefly, super briefly, I think if you don't already buy into these reasons why a city should be looking at green buildings, then you perhaps won't be on the call. Why should city leadership care about promoting green buildings? I think that I'd just like to go over that very quickly. First of all, it's to do with leadership on climate change. Secondly, it's all about economic impact and getting a more efficient private sector in your city domain. Thirdly, it's all about improving welfare for your residents. And perhaps lastly, I'd say it's being part of the global community and recognizing that cities are perhaps the most powerful actor in the world of green buildings and indeed altogether GHG reductions. So if you bought onto, yes, you want to do something in this field, the next thing is, well, what can you do? And here I wanted to share with the people on the line IFCs, what we're beginning to call our theory of change. How might we make markets change and push towards a lower resource consumption pathway? So what I put forward here is really on the left-hand side, what might be for us the key challenges, lack of awareness and experience and a perception of complexity and high cost, and resistance to green codes and also voluntary green certification, and then a lack of common standards which holds back that dialogue between the technical side and the financing side that I think Steve well pointed out. It's very important to have a way of talking across the technical and finance divide to get the finance flowing. So what is not present here and what people often talk about is the extra cost of green building. And the reason why it's not here is we don't consider that a long-term issue. We consider that a short-term issue. There are, in most cases, additional costs, but the payback period, in our experience, is often less than a year, most of the time under 2 to 3 years. So once people get used to building green, there isn't really a commercial barrier. But the challenge is, of course, getting to that used to building green. And to do that, we figured what we needed was a free and easy to use design help that helps people figure out, really, does it cost a lot more to build green or not? And then we need to build an experience base. We need to help the first few leaders in a market develop the early projects that then demonstrate the sound financial sense of building green to the world. So to do all of that, IFC developed as a product of our lending directly to building developers in developing countries, the Edge design software. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But after we developed the software and our clients started using this to quickly convert their projects at very low cost to green, they started clamoring for a certification so that they could explain how good their project was to financiers, to end users, etc. What we're trying to head towards is what we've seen as already demonstrated or beginning to be demonstrated in developed countries. And we're trying to do the same thing in developing countries. So there are a number of pieces of research out there now that are showing that a green building gets a higher sales price, a quicker sale, lower utility bills, that mortgagees have a lower default rate and they're therefore more attractive to banks, and finally that, excuse me, I can't see half my screen here. I just need to move this over a little bit. Finally, that you get a higher resale value for your house if it's green, and that translates through to better collateral for banks. Now, to achieve this and these studies, many developed countries had put in place standards. And what we want to do and are along the road to achieving is develop a cost-effective standard for developing countries to affect the same sort of dynamics that will lead to a virtuous circle of people recognizing the commercial benefits of green buildings across the spectrum. So this is the EDGE certification in a nutshell, what we have put together. It's a free software, which you can find online at www.edgebuildings.com, which allows the layman to evaluate their project, even at the very earliest stages of development, even before you have any designs in hand, within about 20 minutes. And the software shows what additional costs are required, and this is a screenshot, if you like, from the software. It shows what additional steps are required. Here we've got a few energy efficiency measures, and it shows how much incremental cost would be involved. And here you see the before and after. It's you can see why you can do all of this in 20 minutes. You simply click on the different alternatives that you might be interested in. One particularly good one to go for is reducing the window to wall ratio. This decreases the thermal gain of a building in the summertime, reduces air conditioning or other cooling loads, and has a major impact, and yet actually costs less than building with larger windows, because windows are more expensive than a concrete wall. So the software here is showing the base case scenario specific to the particular town in the particular country where you're located, and the improved case responds to what you have chosen here in terms of options. And you can see up here the incremental cost and the payback in number of years. Here, 1.9 years. The idea in this system was to have a very easy to use software, again, that you need no prior training for. A very simple standard, just 20% energy efficiency, 20% water, 20% materials, and something that people can really take to market, and that everybody in the ecosystem in buildings benefits from. So what have we done so far? Using this software, IFC, for its own account, has invested over 3 billion in green buildings. The certification system has over 4 million square meters registered and certified, and we're seeing rapid uptake of usership of the software. You'll see that, of course, IFC being a development institution, we are working in developing countries only, so you'll see that there are lots of places on that map that aren't green that we can't cover. but we are in 140 countries. We're in 5 languages, and we're just adding a 6th language as I speak. We're offering French in addition to Mandarin, Bahasa, Spanish, Portuguese. Here we go. So I thought it would be worth just leaving with you a slide to show overall how IFC feels it can help cities transform their building sector. I'm not going to go through it in a lot of detail. I'll be sharing the slideshow afterwards with Copenhagen. But now we're going to move on to this critical piece down at the bottom. How can we help mobilize finance for municipal projects and the private sector projects that municipal authorities can catalyze? Thought we'd just show a couple of examples of how we've been working with municipalities. Here in South Africa, we've been working with the Western Cape Department of Human Settlements. We've been training their staff on how to use the EDGE certification program. We're looking at putting this into play with 20,000 social housing units. And here I would emphasize, this is green building across the full gamut, from high to the very lowest end in terms of budget per square meter that the EDGE certification is serving. We're also looking to help the city find the sources of funding to cover any incremental costs. Another example of working with cities is Jakarta, and I'm not going to go into this in great detail, but just emphasizing here that we managed to follow through, having started giving advice with actual dollars through both a partial credit guarantee and a loan for a green affordable housing. I'm going to flip over a few of these slides just to give you an idea of the breadth and the depth of our engagement with cities. And I'm going to now just spend a short time on the financing mechanisms that we employ. Now, across IFC, we can work with municipalities directly. We can work with their utilities, and we can work with the private sector companies that provide services. We can help structure the interactions, we can provide training, and we can mobilize finance. We work in a bunch of different sectors, not just green buildings, but green buildings is a key sector for us. And these are the kinds of financial products that we have found useful. Either direct loans to cities with longer than market tenors, or flexibility in amortization, guarantees of debt payment or other performance, enhancement of bond issuances through guarantees, working with cities in a PPP sort of setup, and mobilizing third-party resources that help cities realize their plans, as well as providing debt and equity for the private sector providers of services to cities. We've had a very long relationship with Izmir in Turkey. This is the kind of thing that we love to do, to move with a city through its priorities and work across one sector and then another. And here are some examples of transactions that we've done. A municipal partial bond guarantee with the city of Johannesburg, Another here, a guarantee of a municipal loan, Buffalo City, again in South Africa, and here an example of a bond issuance where we took up most of the bond, and finally an example of an equity investment in an affordable housing fund where we've helped catalyze up to 5,000 green low-income housing units in South Africa. So I'm very conscious that we're tight on time. I'm going to leave it there and look forward to your questions at the end. Thanks very much, everybody.
Hello, Kira. My name is Marko. I work for Econoler. I will now briefly take you through 3 case studies of building efficiency accelerator partner cities that received technical assistance from Econoler under the Ask an Expert initiative. Of course, these technical assistance services were all related to different types of financing solutions. And then if we have some time left, I will briefly present a short overview of the Bulgarian Energy Efficiency Fund and Econoler's experience as a fund manager to this fund. Probably before I go forward in my presentation, it would be good to tell you a couple of words of who we at Econoler are. We are a world-renowned consulting firm specialized in design, development, implementation, evaluation, and financing of various energy efficiency projects and programs. We offer services such as market studies, surveys, statistics, consultations, capacity building. We're designing financing mechanisms. We're developing and managing specialized funds across the globe. The company has been operating for over 35 years now in industrialized and emerging markets alike. And we have been working on more than 4,000 assignments worldwide over these 35 years. So we're pretty much scattered all around the world. Our major offices are, of course, in Canada, in Quebec City and Montreal, but we also do have small offices in DC, in Washington, in Paris, in French-speaking West Africa. We do have offices in Mexico, in Tunisia, Vietnam, and of course here in Sofia. So let me, that is strange. Okay, it works now. So Econoler was tasked by Alliance for Sustainable Energy to support 4 building efficiency accelerator partner cities and help them to better understand the available financing models and sources in their respective markets, or eventually to design and develop or improve such mechanisms of their own. So these cities were namely Mexico City, Rajkot in India, Belgrade, the capital of Serbia, and Da Nang in Vietnam. And while Da Nang is still on hold for reasons that we cannot control, our projects in Mexico City, Rajkot, and Belgrade are either fully completed or about to be completed very soon. So we got only 40 expert hours for each town, which is a week worth of workload. Not much. We had to only focus on more structural tasks rather than digging into the substance of their problems. But despite this little time we had in hand, the results, I think, were more than satisfactory. Of course, some cities we could meet in person because we have an office in Mexico City, so our colleagues there went on and met the city administration. And by chance, I was in Belgrade at the time this project kicked in, so I could meet representatives of Belgrade city administration as well. With others, we could establish communication through either Skype or WebEx or other means of internet-based communication channels. But in both cases, we could identify very good liaison persons at each city administration to provide us with sufficient inputs and then to provide us with very valuable feedback on the deliverables that we produced. Although each of these cities had their specific technical assistance needs, we assume the same approach, starting with interviews with representatives of each city. Then, in close cooperation with them, we have developed and coordinated a concept proposal of what we would offer as technical assistance services. And then, of course, together, hand in hand with the partner cities, we carried out the approved activities. So I'll start with the case of Belgrade, Serbia. Initially, we met the representatives of the city in their offices, actually, and we briefly spoke of what their needs would be. They informed us that they had just set up actually a very small energy efficiency fund within the budget of the city of Belgrade, but they wanted to. They seek some help to make this fund, to scale it up at least, and make it self-sufficient and eventually profitable in the near future. But the discussion with the city revealed that Belgrade does not even have an officially approved energy efficiency paper, energy efficiency strategy document. They have drafted such document, including a very good financial market analysis, and but it was developed like 10 years ago, back in 2008, and was sadly never approved by the city council. So now that the energy efficiency was again high on their political agenda, the city authorities have embarked on the idea to establish an energy efficiency fund, which can be used as a financing mechanism for supporting the implementation of public energy conservation projects. So this energy efficiency fund of Belgrade was effectively set up and registered, established, but was currently having no separate legal identity, actually. It was just a unit vested in the energy secretariat of the city without a separate budget. That was just a sub-account in city of Belgrade's general budget. So what I found out during these discussions, that as of the end of September 2017, the fund was established early 2017. So it was the end of September of the third quarter that the fund had not disbursed a single euro, single Serbian dinar. They had extended no financing to energy efficiency projects whatsoever. So what we suggested was that one approach to helping Belgrade transform their energy efficiency fund into something that is successfully operating would be to collect and review their legal and operational documents, and then eventually develop a concept paper for structural improvement. The suggested approach entailed a number of various activities. We proposed to first, of course, collect and review all the documents related to the fund's legal setup and its operations, then to analyze these documentation and identify potential bottlenecks which may prevent the Belgrade fund from successful performance and achieving its goals, and then finally to develop for the Belgrade Energy Efficiency Fund an improvement concept paper that would include guidelines on how to best structure the fund's operations. These guidelines were intended to cover some key aspects of the fund's operations, such as institutional setup of the fund, including description of roles and responsibilities of each unit and each administrative position within the unit, to describe the fund's risk policies and some investment and financing policy, to set up very broad project eligibility criteria, social and environmental safeguards, etc., etc. At a later stage, we thought that provided a sufficient budget is available, and of course willingness for future cooperation from the city authorities, we were planning to develop an internal capacity within the energy efficiency fund staff, and to teach them how to identify, assess, manage public energy efficiency investments. and then eventually to build upon the outputs of this fund improvement concept paper and develop a fully comprehensive set of internal rules, procedures, and documentation to provide for managing the fund's day-to-day operations in the long term. So of course, the major objective that that we could describe of our task was to support this the city of Belgrade to transform their energy efficiency fund into something that is really successfully operating financial mechanism that can sustain over time and eventually scale up in the future. So we have designed and of course reconciled with the city representatives a very simple implementation methodology. This methodology consisted of 5 different phases. Each phase had then sub-steps embedded into it. So the first phase was the inception and document collection. We identified which documents are needed to be revised and reviewed. Then the second phase was the review and analysis of this documentation. Unfortunately, it was only available in Serbian, so we had to Google Translate to carry forward the task. Then, of course, the third phase, where actually our efforts ended based on the budget restriction, was development of this energy efficiency fund improvement concept paper, and contingent on availability of additional budget, we were planning phase 4, which was mostly capacity building activities, and the last phase 5, development of this fully comprehensive set of internal procedures. So to identify the major bottlenecks and flows in the Belgrade's Energy Efficiency Fund current structure, we have reviewed the existing internal documents that were only in Serbian, as I mentioned. Actually, these were only 2 brief papers, so it was not a lot of work for us. There is only a decision of the mayor of Belgrade for setting up, for establishing the fund, and then there is a program for use of budget assets for the need of Belgrade, and it was only a 1-year program, only considering 2017. Actually, this document was providing the framework of the Belgrade Energy Efficiency Fund, the budget framework for the fund for 2017. So overall, what we found was that the city was planning to spend only about 1 million euros for energy efficiency renovation during 2017. Unfortunately, this money remained undisbursed anyway. So there were a couple or 3 or 4 major bottlenecks that we could identify during the revision of these documents. The first and probably the most significant one was the inappropriate administrative structure of the fund that the city had set up initially. So it was actually that the fund operations were delegated to a department within the city administration that was having other core activities and duties in addition to managing the fund, identifying eligible projects and providing financing for them. So of course, having this fund fully vested into the city administration leads to just a little too high level of political dependence, and oftentimes we know that this can cause just a standstill and not a progress for a financial mechanism. So another bottleneck was the low administrative and technical capacity. That's actually a bottleneck stemming from the first one, because the people designated to run the fund, they had other professional background and other duties to take care of. they paid little attention to the fund development. And then, of course, the overall operational design of the fund we thought that it would prevent the fund from perpetuating its operations over a longer term, because it was structured as a simple budget sub-account, which was meant to just show the money out of the door, which makes the sustainability of such mechanisms really troublesome over a long period of time. So finally, to help the city of Belgrade transform this existing energy efficiency fund or a budget sub-account into something that is self-sustainable and would have sustained success over a long period, we agreed that Econoler will work on this concept that, if then adopted by the local authorities, would address all the bottlenecks and flaws identified, and to propose highly effective administrative and operational structure for the new fund. So that's when we finally embark on the idea of developing something that we called a detailed operation manual outline to the Belgrade Energy Efficiency Fund. So, of course, these guidelines on how to best structure the Energy Efficiency Fund of Belgrade were put at the core of the operations manual concept paper that we developed. And of course, that was because our past experience showed that the neat and robust structuring is an absolutely necessary condition, although that's not a sufficient condition, but it's absolutely necessary condition for success of each financing mechanism we have dealt with in the past. So the concept paper that we developed outlined the major goal of the Belgrade Energy Efficiency Fund, which was namely to evolve and act as a catalyst to accelerate the implementation of various types of energy use reduction investment projects in the city of Belgrade, taking place on the territory of Belgrade. So in doing so, we decided that the fund needs to be governed by a set of principles, of major high-level principles, including transparent investment decision-making processes, a clear and firm investment criteria, effective and efficient and transparent use, of course, of the public funds. The fund needed to provide equal opportunity for all potentially eligible projects, not only to projects owned by the city administration of Belgrade. Another, of course, guiding principle of the operations of the fund should be the transparent reporting, promotion of environmental sustainability as well, and so on and so forth. So, since the fund aimed to foster the activities that lead to efficient energy use in the city of Belgrade, an application to a smaller scale application of renewable energy sources, the proposed operations manual concept was calling for making investment decisions in compliance with several guiding and pretty general investment principles, such as that every project supported by the Belgrade Energy Efficiency Fund should contribute to achieving the overarching goal of the fund and to implementation, of course, of national and city level environmental policies and agreements. That every investment should comply with all applicable environmental planning laws whatsoever. So, depending on the types of projects and to the project owner, applications to the Belgrade Energy Efficiency Fund were decided that may be assessed against different set of key eligibility criteria. We agreed with the city authorities that some of these criteria will only apply to projects that are owned by third parties, by private investors, or by residential buildings, while other requirements will generally apply to all projects that are being financed out of the fund, including projects that are owned by the city of Belgrade or by the state. So based on their importance, we developed a list of eligibility criteria, of course, again, very, very general and subject to further detailization. So the principal eligibility criteria, the major eligibility criteria were that at least half of the project's benefits should come from measurable energy savings, that the project should involve application of well-proven energy saving or renewable energy technology, not financing innovative projects, Another eligibility criteria was that the project cost should range between 2 million and 100 million Serbian dinars, although of course exceptions can only be made if strongly justified. These limitations were set to just fit into the budget framework provided by the city of Belgrade. So we had a set of complementary secondary eligibility criteria, such as the benefits from the projects need to be sustained after the lifetime of the project activity. Other criteria was that the project should offer good value for the money, should provide economy efficiency and effectiveness to the investment. Another secondary criteria was that the project can be linked and should be linked with the country's national and city and Belgrade city energy efficiency strategies and policies. So then we decided that setting up a good and neat monitoring and reporting framework for the fund would be of crucial importance as well, because we believe that collecting feedback information on projects, financial and technical performance is very important to the management of an EU fund, of an energy efficiency fund in general, and will provide for its ongoing improvement in the future. So we set responsibilities for the future energy efficiency fund team to monitor the performance of each project and to periodically collect relevant reported data in accordance with initially designated designed project monitoring plan. So the purpose, we were planning a twofold monitoring and reporting processes. First, we wanted to have a robust financial monitoring and reporting, which aim was to ensure that financing received by final beneficiaries, public money, should be used in compliance with the financing conditions approved, and to serve this financial monitoring system to serve as an early warning system for potential budget overruns that may eventually be encountered in the process of project implementation. And the fund team was also to be required to periodically collect data about technical performance. That's the second layer of the monitoring activities. So the technical performance of the project should be screened. Information such as calculations of green impact actually achieved and so on. So that the information can serve to evaluate the project's compliance with the specific objectives and the eligibility criteria of the fund. So finally, the operations manual provided rules for reporting frequency, types of reports to be submitted, requirements to be met, and so on. In the end of the document, we describe the eventual project cycle of that will take place in the Belgrade Energy Efficiency Fund. So the operations manual concept paper provided a sequence of procedural steps that will be required from implementing the project cycle within the fund. So these steps had to be structured into separate phases, including project identification, project appraisal, approval, procurement of project contractor, financial closure and disbursement of funds, and then project monitoring and evaluation. So the proposed project cycle was presented in a form of a checklist, like a laundry list, including in orderly manner a description of every step of the process and the administrative position or the unit within the fund that was responsible for the performance of this step. So that was pretty much the structure of the operations manual that we designed. We then sent it to the city of Belgrade. The Secretariat of Energy reviewed this proposal, came back to us with comments and counter proposals for further improvement, and it was then finally approved by the Energy Secretariat of the city of Belgrade. But I'm afraid it's still not approved by the city council, so it's still on hold. Then I don't actually know how much time do we have left, so I'll briefly take you through the case of Rajkot, India. That's a town rather small for the Indian standards. It's located in the central part of the country, with about 1.2 to 1.3 million inhabitants. So the municipal administration, during our initial discussions with them, the municipal administration of the city of Rajkot was aware that the long-term planning of energy needs is a key element to the long-term economic development of their town, and that an energy efficiency strategy and action plan would be an important steps for reducing the environmental impact in the energy dependence of the town. So what they asked us was to just develop, of course, a very restricted version of this energy efficiency strategy and action plan. So because of this budget restriction, we developed something that was, it ended up being a hybrid between a very limited version of energy efficiency strategy and action plan and guidelines to the city on how to eventually develop a full-scale strategy and action plan in the future. So our energy efficiency strategy was based on only 2 audited buildings, because we only obtained information of 2 municipally owned buildings with ready energy audits, which were even not investment grade audits. So these 2 buildings, the Rajkot Municipal Corporation Central Zone building and the Multi-Activity Center, we reviewed and revised the energy audits of the 2 buildings, and then assumed that the results of these 2 can be further extrapolated to the remaining Rajkot municipality building stock. So the energy efficiency strategy and action plan that we developed investigated opportunities for implementing infrastructure for more efficient, not only for buildings, but for more efficient supply and use of energy, as well as it was defining the strategy, and the action plan paper was defining the activities intended to improve the local energy use and so on. So we started with the very first phase of our project, the initiation. We developed this energy efficiency strategy based on in this interdisciplinary team that designed the processes for developing further the full scale strategy and action plan. So we started with several simple steps, just first defining the needs, and eventually taking steps to persuading the local administration to approve for such a development of such a comprehensive energy efficiency strategy and action plan. The core energy efficiency and strategy and action plan development was assumed in a multi-phase approach. We started with developing an inventory of buildings that are owned either by the city of Rajkot or by the city corporation. And then, of course, the data collection process, we only obtained information, as I mentioned earlier, we only obtained information for two buildings, but we left instructions on how data should be collected, who should be doing what in order to collect the information that would be necessary later on. And then the third step was data analysis. So we left again clear instructions on how to identify energy efficiency opportunities and how to establish an estimate of required investments. Of course, energy audits need to be conducted at every building, every facility that is owned by the town. The next step was the data aggregation. That again, our instruction provided that the specific indicators enabling to compare data across different facilities or different buildings need to be aggregated from individual facility data collection forms into a sector-specific benchmarking and ranking table, so that the city's energy efficiency team can use a number of indicators and to make comparisons based on different indicators such as the specific annual energy consumption, the energy intensity per unit of area, or per employee per year, stuff like this. So the next step was calling for a data normalization, because of course the selected energy indicators needed to be normalized according to the climate conditions of the city of Rajkot, so as to enable comparing and benchmarking these related indicators, because it is impossible to compare the energy used per square meter among buildings if one or another building is undercooled, or the lighting is not properly working, or under the illumination standards. So the normalization process was therefore expected to provide a balanced and more unbiased comparison of the buildings and their energy consumption profiles. Unfortunately, I won't be able to go over the Bulgarian Energy Efficiency Fund, but I think that was only a secondary task. So yeah, well, finally we designed these guidelines, a very simple version of the energy efficiency strategy and action plan of the city of Rajkot, and the guidelines to their energy efficiency team on how to develop in the future a comprehensive version of this document. We ended up with mapping the potential sources of financing for these two specific buildings that we had reviewed and revised. So we have reviewed almost all existing options in the local market for financing the energy efficiency measures that were identified through the energy efficiency audits for these two buildings. What we found out was actually that the investment scale of these two buildings, of the projects, was very, very small. Actually, the energy audits were calling for mostly either no cost or low cost measures, so it wasn't worth the efforts to apply for bank financing or to develop a dedicated investment vehicle just for the sake of implementing these two projects. So we therefore proposed to the city authorities that the implementation of these two projects should focus on internal resources that they have in their own budget. So we suggested that the energy saving measures should be financed several 2 or 3 possible installments stretching across 2 or 3 fiscal years for the budget, not to burden the budget too much. And we would, for example, propose to the city that energy saving measures for replacement of the ceiling fans could be financed in 3 consecutive years using the energy budget, while the installation of the water tap resistors could be financed through the water bills, because it was the payback period, expected payback period was less than 1 year. So that's how we ended up. We didn't have to design a tailored financial mechanism or to seek commercial financing or eventually financing for international financing institutions or donor agencies. So the last city that we worked on this building efficiency accelerator initiative was Mexico City. Just in 2 words, their administration, their authorities were interested in applying in an ESCO model, an EPC model for financing building efficiency, and they were seeking to understand a little bit more about the concept of EPC and ESCO in general. But during our discussions, we found out that actually Deloitte was already assigned to carry out an ESCO market survey in Mexico City and in general Mexican market for public buildings. So they asked us to study the application of ESCO model in private sector buildings. They wanted to support the private sector to engage more intensively in energy efficiency through EPC and using the services of ESCO companies. So that was what we did. Actually, we we carried out a short market survey providing ideas on what are the existing ESCO companies in the market, what are the usual EPC approaches that have been employed in the Mexican market, which are the most active companies, which are the most reliable ones, and what still needs to be done is to organize a workshop to present these findings to the environmental fund of Mexico City staff, and this will be done in the near future by our colleagues who are based in Mexico City. So yeah, sorry I didn't have the time to go over the Bulgarian Energy Efficiency Fund, and I guess I'll have the time on another occasion. Thanks, I'll be glad to answer your questions. That's from me. So now, Aris, I guess back to you.
Thank you, Marko. Thank you very much for your interesting presentation. Now let's go to our question. The first question is for Steve. Steve, the question is, I work with a network of small municipalities in a developing country. We have a number of small projects on multi-family building renovation with very similar standardized energy efficiency interventions. We do not have the capacity to borrow from large development banks, and ESCOs, in our case, do not work in the residential sector because of high risks and other barriers. And the question is, what financial model would you suggest to potentially finance such a portfolio of projects?
Okay, good question. So the fact that you have standardized projects across a portfolio and there's aggregation is good because that takes it to some sensible volume. I think it does depend on how these properties are owned or co-managed, I guess. So, I mean, the first place or first port of call probably should be a bank on some kind of mortgage or additional debt if you can prove that the savings exceed the debt repayments, which should be possible. Other than that, I think maybe, especially if you've got an aggregation of public sector or authorities coming together, perhaps some kind of almost community crowdfunding that's been tried in a few places. That's another option. So I think there's a few ideas, but I mean, it's good that there's an aggregation and commonality of projects. That's always critical, I think, so that you can start to get decent volume, which does make people more interested in the projects. So those are my initial thoughts.
Thank you, Steve. The next question, if you have a little bit of more time, is for you again. And the question is, do you see mortgage lenders acknowledging that their lending risk is reduced when borrowers use energy efficiency projects to reduce their exposure to energy commodity price volatility?
Yeah, I think that is coming, and we've seen it perhaps more in the commercial market than the residential market, but there is an increasing recognition amongst leading banks and financial institutions interested in this area that lending on energy efficiency helps to reduce risk, and it helps to reduce risk in two ways. One, customers are more likely to have more money, so they can more likely to pay the debt back. There's less effect of volatility, and also in those markets where regulations are driving this, it reduces the risk for the institution of having stranded assets. And I think this is an area that's only going to grow, because what we're seeing globally is more pressure on the banks and the financial institutions to report their climate-related risks. And so when you start having to do that, you start to recognize that, having loans out to a load of inefficient properties, for instance, whether they're commercial or residential, is high risk, and having money on energy efficiency projects is low risk. So I think ultimately it will be driven by banking regulation and banking norms, which all the trends globally, but also, specifically in Europe at the moment, there's rapid progress being made on that front. So yeah, I think there's increasing recognition. We still need to collect lots of data and prove it, because one of the problems in this whole area is a paucity or a shortage of data to prove these propositions. But yeah, it's definitely heading that way, which is good.
Thank you, Steve. The next question is for Corinne, and the question is, could you please elaborate on municipal partial bond guarantee and municipal bond insurance, and how a city can benefit from this mechanism to finance energy efficiency projects?
Sure. So the partial guarantees that we get involved with, they could be for any sort of bond or indeed a loan. But obviously, within the realm of climate-related investment, we would specify the eligible assets to be financed. And then on the guarantee side, we would sometimes in climate-related investments and green buildings in particular, we might have access to concessional finance from certain donors who could really reduce the cost of the guarantee of a bond to investors, to turn that bond into, of course, a higher credit-rated bond, and therefore reduce the yield on the bond and the price to the issuer on the bond. I hope that explains how the mechanism works. Essentially, IFC either provides a full-priced guarantee, or if we're lucky and sponsored by a donor, because it's a GHG beneficial sort of transaction, we might be able to provide a lower price on the guarantee, and the buyers of the bond benefit from the guarantee and therefore are willing to accept a lower interest rate on the bond.
Thank you, Corinne. The next question is for Marko, and the question is, what were the criteria to choose the 4 partner cities?
The 4 partner cities were actually selected by the BEA, and as far as I know, they're extending this type of technical assistance services to their most active partners. Cities that are pretty much active in their involvement with the BEA.
Thank you. And the next question also it's for you, Marko. And the question is, could you please show or mention any example of current EU funding program or initiative for energy efficiency financing?
Well, what's the definition of EU funding? For instance, the first thing that comes across my mind is, of course, a project that we are about to start in the coming weeks in Palestine, where that's generally a credit line from the AFD, the French Development Agency, to local banks, supported by a grant component provided by the EU. So would that be an EU-backed financing mechanism? I guess yes. Otherwise, there are a lot of structural funds and cohesion funds provided by the EU and supporting with huge grants investments in energy efficiency. At least here in Bulgaria, because I'm based in Bulgaria, so I know of several programs funded by the structural funds of the EU that are targeting investments in energy efficiency in various sectors, starting from agriculture to transportation to increasing the overall competitiveness of the national economy, providing grants to local SMEs.
Thank you, Marko. The next question is for Corinne, and the question is, are reduced maintenance costs, example, relamping when LEDs replace other kind of lamps, considered in EDS?
No. So the longer lifetime of the LED is not, and therefore the lower need for maintenance to change the bulbs is not included in the cash calculator of years of payback. we've limited the value of reduced utility bills to simply the cut in energy and water consumption, not in other sorts of operating costs.
Thank you for the detailed responses to the questions. Ladies and gentlemen, finally, we come to the end of our event today. We do hope you have enjoyed it and found the content of value. I would like to say thanks to the panelists for the informative and interesting presentation, and to the audience for their active participation. The presentation will be beneficial for all stakeholders involved in energy efficiency and green buildings. Thank you for your attention, and wish you a good day or night from Copenhagen.